All right, so we have Aristotle's view of happiness on the table. This is what living a good life looks like. It's rational activity in accordance with virtue, and there are a variety of virtues. You have all the moral virtues, and then you have these intellectual virtues. That raises the question, what exactly are all these virtues equal? Are some of them more important than others? And if so, which ones? In Aristotle's view, some of them are indeed more important than others. And indeed, the most important one is wisdom. Why he thinks that, we'll see in just a second. But what I want to do right now is say a little bit more about what he thinks about wisdom. And to do that, we're going to turn to the beginning of the metaphysics. So the very first line of the metaphysics, all human beings by nature desire to know. It is part of human nature to seek knowledge. And the metaphysics is going to be an account, the whole work is an account of what the best or highest or most important kind of knowledge is, the kind of knowledge with the most truth, the most fundamental kind of knowledge. He calls that wisdom. In the passage that we read, he clarifies what kind of thing wisdom is, right? So we have this virtue from the Nicomachean Ethics. It's this intellectual virtue. Okay, fine. Well, what is it? What kind of thing is it? In the Nicomachean Ethics, he doesn't actually say all that much about it. He describes it very briefly in book 6, but he doesn't say much about it, and we didn't read book 6. We get a much more extended account of it here in the Metaphysics. So first, he's going to clarify what kind of thing it is. And as I was just alluding to, in Aristotle's view, it's a kind of knowledge. Wisdom is a kind of knowledge. Now, also in Aristotle's view, knowledge is something very specific. He's like Plato. If you recall, when we were going over Plato, when you look out the window and you see a tree out there, Plato wouldn't say that you know about trees just because you see the tree or whatever. Knowledge is this kind of mastery, according to Plato. It's this grasping of the form of tree. Well, Aristotle has a similar idea. Aristotle would think a similar kind of thing. The way he puts the point here in the metaphysics is that knowledge is going to be of explanations or causes or principles. And we saw this idea in the physics as well at the beginning of the physics. The person who has knowledge is the person who can explain things, right? And so I don't have knowledge of trees because I couldn't really tell you much about them. A tree scientist, a botanist, whatever, I don't know what they're called, right? They could explain why trees do what they do, why they have the shape that they do, and so on. They could explain the quote unquote behavior of trees. They could give explanations. That's the person with knowledge, according to Aristotle, the person who can give explanations. Just little old me, Jeff, I don't really have knowledge of trees because I can't cite causes, principles, or really explanations of things concerning trees. Okay, fair enough. So Aristotle is kind of confining knowledge to knowledge of explanations. The knowledge is fundamentally concerned with explanations. But so is wisdom just, knowing about trees? No, according to Aristotle. It's not. Wisdom is a particular kind of knowledge. There are lots of different branches of knowledge, lots of different sciences, right? There's tree science, there's astronomy, there's geometry. They're all different kinds of sciences, according to Aristotle. Wisdom is one kind of science. It's one branch of science. It's in some sense the most fundamental. So the way Aristotle puts the point, wisdom is knowledge not just of any old cause or explanation or principle. It's knowledge of first causes, explanations, and principles. It's knowledge of the most fundamental explanations, causes, and principles. So, for instance, if you were to ask, well, why am I here right now? You could give different kinds of, you could use different sciences to explain that. So you might use biology. You might say, well, the reason Jeff is here right now is because 30 some odd years ago, I don't even know how old I am, his parents did something that we don't need to think about very much. And so that's why he's here, right? You can cite the biological explanation. But then somebody might say, no, 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 I want something more fundamental. Like you're assuming that there are organisms and things like that, and let's not assume that. Like, why are there even those things? And then so somebody might say, well, because oh, I know, because of physics, because particles, whatever, get together and there are forces, and then you whatever you play that out and you get organisms or whatever. But physics is the kind of more fundamental explanation. And so the reason that Jeff is here right now is because of particles, quarks and leptons and atoms and whatever bumping against each other according to certain forces. That's a more fundamental explanation. But you might say, no, 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 no. That's not even fundamental enough yet because you're assuming that there are forces and protons and leptons and quarks and whatever else and particles. I want something even more fundamental, right? Why is there anything? Why is there not nothing? What is the cause of existence in the first place? What, in the way Aristotle puts the point, what is the cause or explanation of being? That's what wisdom is concerned with. That is going to be the science or knowledge of first causes, first explanations, first principles. It's the answer, it's going to answer the question of why there's not nothing. Right. And so wisdom is knowledge of the most fundamental explanations and principles of reality. That's what wisdom is concerned with. He sometimes, instead of calling it wisdom, he'll call it first philosophy. He'll sometimes call it metaphysics. And he's got another name for it, which we'll see in just a second. So first, he clarifies what kind of thing wisdom is. It's knowledge of first causes. Second, he determines what the object of wisdom is. What is this first cause or explanation or principle? He tells us God is the first cause or principle or explanation. And in Aristotle's view, he's got a particular view of God. It's this unmoved mover. We are going to look at the unmoved mover, what exactly Aristotle thinks about God, next week. But God, this unmoved mover in the particular way that Aristotle conceptualizes it, is the fundamental explanation and principle of all reality. And so he'll also refer to wisdom as theology. First philosophy, metaphysics, wisdom, theology. They are all the same thing. They are the science of the first principles of reality, which is just the science of God. That's wisdom. Now, let's return to the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, Chapter 7. Aristotle discusses wisdom there again, and he relates it to the other virtues. Before we turn to Book 10, Chapter 7, it's important to point out one detail from Book 1, Chapter 7, from the conclusion of the function argument, because he reiterates this in Book 10, Chapter 7. The conclusion of the function argument, when we were going over it, the way I stated it was that happiness is rational activity in accordance with virtue. Happiness is acting virtuously. That's the conclusion of the function argument. That, strictly speaking, is inaccurate. The conclusion of the function argument, if you read it, what Aristotle says is that happiness is rational activity in accordance with virtue. And if there's more than one virtue, well, then the most complete and best virtue. We didn't pay attention to that qualification when we were going over the function argument, but now let's go back to it. Let's pay attention to it because there are indeed more than one virtue. There is more than one virtue. There are a lot of virtues: wisdom, prudence, generosity, justice, bravery or courage, self-control, right? There's that list. And so now we want to know, what's the best one? What's the best virtue? What's the most complete virtue? Because strictly speaking, that's going to be what happiness consists in. It's going to be the activity of the best virtue. And it'll be a kind of secondary happiness to activate the other virtues, right? The activity of the other virtues is still going to count as happiness, but it's a lesser kind of happiness. It's a secondary kind of happiness. Well, what Aristotle states here in Book 10, Chapter 7, is that the best virtue, the most complete virtue, is going to be the virtue of the best thing in us. And the best thing in us is our mind or our intellect. Recall the De Anima when Aristotle talks about our minds, about thinking. Our minds are a kind of quasi-divine part of us. That's his idea. The best thing in us is our intellect or our minds. It's the most divine part of us. The nutritive or perceptive part of us, yeah, that's in us. That's okay. And that's all fine and good. But that's not the best part of us. The best part of us is going to be the part of us that we share in common with the divine. And that is not our nutritive faculties. That's not our perceptive faculties. That's our minds, our thinking faculties, our intellect. And wisdom is the virtue of that part of us. And so the best virtue, Aristotle claims, is wisdom. And so happiness, strictly speaking, is the activity of wisdom. That is, in some sense, the final cause of human beings. Aristotle has a technical term for the activity of wisdom. He calls it contemplation. And so putting that all together, right? He doesn't mean by contemplation just kind of spacing out and thinking about whatever. He means understanding God as the first cause of all things, going through that science, right? The science that is wisdom, that is the knowledge of first causes and principles. That's contemplation. It's thinking through that science, thinking through the way in which God is the first principle of all things and the explanation, the ultimate explanation for all things. That's contemplation. And so thinking through God as the first cause of all things, contemplating, that's the best life. Because that's what God itself does. Inasmuch as we contemplate, we engage in the very same activity that God engages in. We engage in the divine activity. And so human beings are a strange kind of creature. We are animals on the one hand who eat and see and feel things, right? And so we share something in common with ferns and tigers and whatever else. But we also have this divine element to us that can ascend beyond the sensible world and can engage in the very same activity that God or the gods, and there might be multiple of them according to Aristotle, that the gods engage in. And so the best life for a human being is to try to transcend this kind of animal nature that we have and to live a contemplative life, a divine life as far as we can. And so that really is the final cause of a human being. That's what it is. That's what the good of a human being is. That's what the purpose of a human being is, right? The reason human beings develop in the way that they do, that for the sake of which, right, to put it in that earlier terminology, is contemplating. Everything we do as human beings should be ordered toward that, toward this wisdom, toward this contemplation. More generally, the idea is everything we should do should be ordered toward cultivating the life of the mind, right? The pursuit of the fundamental truths of reality. Truth is what's most important. So we see Aristotle pulling a similar kind of move as Plato pulled in the image of the cave. We need to orient ourselves towards truth because truth is of the utmost value, and truth about the fundamental causes of reality is the most important kind of truth. Human beings by nature desire to know. Human beings by nature are geared to be fulfilled by truth. That's Aristotle's view, right? And so the final cause of human beings is living this kind of contemplative life, living a divine life as far as we can. Now, that does not mean that the other kinds of virtues are worthless. That does not mean justice and generosity and so on are worthless. No, 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 no. Aristotle wants to say those things are still important too. They are not as important as wisdom, however. And this will be the last thing, one sign he gives for this, why is justice not important or not as great, not as good of a virtue as wisdom, say? Well, because it'd be better if we didn't have to use justice at all. It'd be better if there were no need for justice. Justice can't be the end of human life, the purpose of human life. If it would be better if we didn't have to be just at all. Well, why would it be better if we didn't have to be just? Look at justice, Aristotle would say. Justice is typically used to rectify ill treatment. Someone has been treated poorly. Someone has been discriminated against, or some group has been discriminated against, or something like that. We need just activity to rectify those situations, to ameliorate them. Aristotle's point is that it would be better if nothing needed to be ameliorated in the first place, if those people weren't treated unfairly in the first place. It would be better if we had no need of justice. But if that's the case, well, then justice can't be the best thing that there is, because it'd be better if we didn't have to use it. It would be better if no one were ever treated unfairly, so we didn't have to use justice, so we could devote more of our time to intrinsically worthwhile activity, such as contemplating the divine. That is Aristotle's view. Intrinsically worthwhile activity, such as developing our intellects, developing our minds, pursuing truth.